Late May on the Dakota prairie, and the wind carries a smell that does not belong to spring, sour mash and dust, and something sharper underneath, the chemical bite of green powder stacked on a store shelf 3 miles south. The potato rows are barely ankle high. Under their leaves, clusters of orange eggs darken toward red. An old man kneels at the end of a row, one arm hanging lower than the other, measuring the space between plants with a notched stick. Behind him, penned in willow hurdles, 60 birds stand motionless in the heat. Their eyes are clouded. Their bills tap at empty tin pans, steady and patient, finding nothing. 3 miles north of Hope, North Dakota, on a quarter section of wind-scraped prairie that had not changed owners in 26 years, Oddman Breka stood in a yard full of ducks and watched the last wagon turn south without unloading. The year was 1906. The month was late May. The oat sacks sat in the wagon bed exactly where the men had placed them at the rail elevator, and they would ride back to the elevator because Oddman could not pay the teamster's extra fee, and the teamster would not haul grain 3 miles for a promise. The wagon's iron rims cut tracks in the soft road. Dust lifted and settled on the fence wire. 60 runner ducks pressed against split willow hurdles and watched the grain leave with heads tilted, their upright bodies still as fence posts. Eli stood at the gate. She was 10. Her red hands gripped the top rail, and she did not cry because crying had stopped producing results sometime around February. Behind her, Kittle kicked a post. He was 13, wiry, proud, and useless against arithmetic. The grain was gone. The ducks needed feed. The fields were not yet green enough to forage. Oddman did not watch the wagon. He watched the ducks. 17 of the 60 were old enough to show cloudy eyes. 4 could barely see the fence in front of them. The neighbors had a name for all 60, a name that folded the old birds and the young ones into a single verdict: blind ducks. The phrase was not accurate. It was cruel and easy, and cruel, easy things survive longer than truth on a prairie where entertainment comes cheap. He had owned this claim since 1880. 160 acres filed at the land office for $14. He had broken sod with a borrowed team, built a house from cottonwood and freight lumber, married a woman named Sigri, who bore one daughter and died holding another, who did not breathe. The daughter grew, married a wheat farmer east of the river, and died of fever in the winter of 1905, leaving 2 children in Oddman's kitchen with nothing but a trunk of clothes and the kind of silence that fills a house when adults cannot explain what happened. Kittle and Eli, his daughter's children, his responsibility now, and his reason for standing in a yard full of ducks that the county considered a joke. The winter had been the problem before the beetles became the problem. 1905 into 1906 pushed cold deep into January and held it there. The root cellar ran low by Christmas, the last firm potatoes went into soup in March, and the soup got thinner every week until Eli stopped asking what was in it. Oddman sold 2 young ducks for cash. He bartered eggs for flour. He owed Reuben Kark's store $38 carried from autumn, and Kark had stopped pretending the debt was friendly. Now it was planting season, and the 6 acres of potatoes that would decide whether they ate through next winter were already in the ground. 7 acres of oats beside them, a kitchen garden. 1 milk cow named Tulla, who gave less every month, and 60 ducks that needed grain to survive until the fields could carry them on forage, and no way to get that grain home because the wagon axle had cracked in April, and Oddman's right shoulder, torn in a threshing accident 3 years back, could not swing a maul to set a new one. He had asked 3 neighbors. Each refused, not from hatred, from timing. The Colorado Potato Beetle had appeared in the earliest shoots across the settlement, and every man with the team was saving horsepower for his own fields. Nobody had hours to haul grain for an old Norwegian, and his 60 birds that could not see. The beetles changed everything. Not because they were new, the insects had plagued Dakota potatoes for decades, but because this spring they came early, thick, and hungry. Yellow-striped adults emerged from the soil where they had wintered, climbed the young stems, and began chewing leaves before the plants had enough growth to survive the damage. Females laid clusters of orange eggs on the undersides of leaves, and within days the red larvae hatched and started eating from the edges inward. A healthy potato plant could lose some leaf and recover. A plant stripped to the stem before tubers set would produce nothing underground worth digging. 6 acres of potatoes, 400 bushels if the plants held. Oddman needed 120 bushels for the household, enough to feed 2 children and himself from October through April, 20 bushels for seed, 30 to barter for flour, salt, lamp oil, and coal, another share to cover the $38 at Kark's store, where prices ran high because Kark knew his customers could not ride to the next town. If the beetles took the leaves before the tuber set, Oddman would enter winter with 2 children, a debt, and nothing in the cellar but dirt. That was the arithmetic. Nobody needed a professor to explain it, but a professor came anyway. Anson Beck arrived in Hope on the 2nd Tuesday of June, riding the Northern Pacific Spur with a leather case, 2 glass jars of live beetles, a paper sack of Paris green, and the confidence of a man who had never missed a meal he could not replace. He was attached to the North Dakota Agricultural College as a traveling lecturer, and his job was to teach farmers the proper modern method of killing insects. The proper modern method was poison. Paris green, copper acetoarsenite, had been the answer to the Colorado potato beetle since 1867, when someone in the Mississippi Valley discovered that dusting the bright green powder on potato leaves killed the insects that ate them. By 1906, every general store in Dakota sold it. The powder came in tins and paper sacks. It was mixed with flour to make it cling, cut with lime to reduce leaf burn, and applied wet or dry depending on who was talking. It worked. It also killed chickens that ate dusted beetles, poisoned milk cows that grazed near treated fields, burned children's skin when they touched sacks stored near food, and washed into garden soil after every hard rain. Nobody talked about that part at the lecture. Beck stood in Kark's store with his jars and his sprayer and spoke to 14 men who nodded because nodding was easier than admitting they could not afford the treatment he described. Dust while the dew holds, Beck said. Cut 2 parts flour to 1 part green. Add lime if the leaves are tender. Reapply after rain. Start early. Do not wait for damage. Treat every row. The cost per acre was manageable if a man bought in quantity. Manageable. The word sat in the room like a stone in a shoe. Every man present owed Kark money. Paris green cost money. Credit came through Kark, and credit from Kark came with a lien on the crop. Oddman stood in the back of the store. He had walked the 3 miles because the mare, Ragna, was too old to carry him at speed and too valuable to tire on errands. He listened to Beck describe the chemistry of killing and thought about Eli's cough and Tulla's milk and the shallow pans where his ducks cleaned their bills every morning. After the lecture, Beck walked Oddman's patch. The professor moved between rows with his hands clasped behind his back, bending occasionally to turn a leaf and count eggs. His cuffs were clean. His boots had been oiled that morning. He looked at 6 acres of young potato plants, at the willow hurdles holding 60 ducks in the side yard, at the shack where tools leaned against walls because there was no shed, and he delivered his verdict standing in the row middle with the same voice he used at the lectern. 6 acres, old man. If they hatch full, you will not save 1 row. Not with boys, not with hand-picking, and certainly not with ducks that cannot see the plants in front of them. Oddman said nothing. He had learned decades ago that silence in the face of authority was not weakness, it was storage. He was storing Beck's words in the place where useful information lived beside useless advice, and he would sort them later. Beck continued. He said the beetle arithmetic was simple. One female laid 300 to 500 eggs in a season. A dozen females overwintering in 1 acre of soil could produce thousands of larvae in weeks. The larvae ate leaves. Without leaves, the plant could not feed the tuber. Without tubers, the family could not eat. That was the math. And the only answer to the math was poison applied on schedule by a man who understood dosage. He looked at Odmund's shoulder, at the way the old man held his right arm slightly forward to keep the joint from grinding. He looked at the ducks behind their hurdles. He shook his head. I can write you a recommendation for credit at the store, Beck said. Kark will extend it if I sign. Odmund understood what that meant. A signature from the professor would convince Kark to lend, and the loan would carry a lien, and the lien would give Kark first claim on stored potatoes if Odmund could not pay in cash by autumn. It was not help. It was a door that locked from the outside. No, Odmund said. Beck adjusted his hat. He said, stubbornness is not a crop plan. He walked back to the road without waiting for a reply. The idea did not arrive like lightning. It arrived like a torn grain sack. 3 days after Beck's visit, Odmund gave up waiting for help and dragged 1 sack of cracked oats from the elevator himself. He used a door laid flat as a sled, hitched to Ragna with rope, and pulled the sack along the road shoulder for 3 miles in afternoon heat that pressed sweat through his shirt and made his shoulder scream with each jolt over a rut. The sack tore 200 yards from the gate. Barley and cracked oats spilled into the dust of the yard. Odmund dropped the rope and stood there with his bad arm hanging and his good hand on his knee, breathing through his teeth while grain scattered across packed dirt and dried manure. 1 duck pushed through a gap in the willow hurdle. She was white, old, and nearly blind. A female the children called Marte because she tilted her head the same way the schoolteacher did when a student gave a wrong answer. Marte walked into the scattered grain with her neck low and her bill sweeping the ground. The younger sighted ducks were still behind the fence, heads bobbing, trying to find the gap Marte had used. They could see the grain. Marte could not. But Marte reached the spill first, and her bill moved through the dust and chaff with a speed and precision that stopped Odmund where he stood. She did not peck. She swept. The bill moved side to side in quick arcs, touching the ground, pressing against pebbles and hulls and grain with equal attention. She found kernels under chaff. She found cracked oats buried in hoof prints. She worked ground the sighted birds had not reached because they were still looking for the opening in the fence, and she found every kernel in a circle the size of a wagon wheel before the first young duck pushed through after her. Odmund watched, and the watching hit a wall in his memory and broke through to the other side. He was 8 years old. His mother's kitchen in a valley in western Norway. Stone floor, cold even in summer. Wet feathers. The smell of warm mash in a wooden trough. His mother had taken a duck, not a runner, a common farmyard duck, and tied a strip of cloth over its eyes. She dropped barley into the trough 1 kernel at a time, spacing them across the wet wood. The duck found every kernel. Not slowly, quickly. The bill swept and tapped and found grain by feel alone, because a duck's bill was not a beak like a chicken's. It was a hand, soft at the edges, hard at the nail, threaded with nerves that could read the difference between a stone and a seed in mud. His mother had guided his fingers along the duck's bill. "Feel that," she said, "the little bumps." That is how she sees in the dark. Oddmund had filed the lesson the way children file things that have no immediate use. Now, 40 years later, standing in a North Dakota yard with a torn sack and an aching shoulder, the lesson came back with the force of something that had been waiting. The beetles were not all on the leaves all the time. He knew this because he had watched them for decades. Adults emerged from soil where they overwintered. Larvae dropped from leaves when disturbed. Late larvae crawled down to pupati in the dirt near the plant base. Rain knocked beetles and larvae into row middles. Wind shook them loose. At dawn and dusk, when the air was cool, the adults were sluggish, sitting on lower stems and soil ridges where a human hand could pick them, but a human eye could miss them among clods and chaff. A duck's bill did not need to see them. A duck's bill needed to touch them. And a duck's bill could work under leaves, along hill shoulders, in loose-turned soil, across row middles. Every place where human fingers were too slow and human eyes were too high. The question was not whether ducks ate beetles. Any fool who kept ducks near a garden knew they ate beetles. The question was whether ducks could be moved through living potato rows without destroying the plants, in numbers large enough to matter, on a schedule tight enough to keep ahead of a hatch that doubled every week. That was the question Oddmund could not answer from his yard, but he knew someone who might have part of the answer written in a letter he had saved for 6 years. He went inside and dug through the trunk beside the stove. Under Sigri's wedding cloth and a bundle of letters from the old country, he found a single sheet in a careful hand. Burrowing, a widowed poultry keeper 15 miles east, near the Cheyenne River, who raised upright ducks in wet meadow ground and sold hatching eggs along the rail line. She had sold Oddmund his first runner eggs in 1900 and written him once afterward with instructions he had only half followed. The letter ended with a line he had read once and forgotten. A duck sees with its face when the ground is soft. Oddmund read the line 3 times. Then he sat at the table and began drawing rows on the back of a feed receipt with a pencil stub, measuring distances with his thumb, and talking to himself in Norwegian because some calculations only work in the language where you learn to count. He did not simply plan to release ducks. He designed a system, and the system was either the salvation of his crop or the fastest way to destroy it with his own hands. Willow hurdle lanes, 22 inches wide, running between the potato rows, narrow enough to keep the ducks moving forward, wide enough that they would not panic and trample plants. He would cut willow from the creek bottom and weave light panels that one person, even a person with a bad shoulder, could shift from row to row. Morning and dusk passes only. Beetles were sluggish in cool air, and the potato stems were less brittle when dew kept them flexible. Midday heat made plants snap under pressure, and ducks under hot sun drank too much water and slowed. Teams of 12, not 60 at once. 12 ducks in a lane could work without crowding. 5 teams rotating through acres gave each team rest, and each acre repeated attention. Water pans every 40 yards. Ducks needed to rinse their bills to keep the nerve endings sensitive. Mud clogged the bill like dirt on fingertips. Clean bills found more insects. Feed withheld lightly before field work, then rewarded after with mash. A duck that had eaten its fill would ignore beetles. A duck that was starving would tear at anything, including leaves. The balance was hunger that sharpened attention without creating frenzy. Children stationed at row ends with poles wrapped in cloth. Guiding, not striking. The poles directed turns, not punishment. A frightened duck was a destructive duck. Blind and cloudy-eyed birds placed in the center of each team. The flock movement around them would keep them oriented. They would not lead. They would not trail. They would work the middle, where the density of bodies kept them straight. The risk was absolute. If the ducks trampled plants, Oddman would destroy his own crop faster than the beetles. If he undercooked the timing, the hatch would outrun the birds. If he overfed them, they would walk through beetles without interest. If he underfed them, they would weaken and stop working within days. Every variable pointed toward failure. The only variable pointing toward success was a memory of his mother's hands and a nearly blind duck named Marte, who had found grain and dust faster than birds with perfect eyes. It was not enough evidence for any reasonable person. Oddmund was not interested in being reasonable. He was interested in October. Niels Moen came by on a Thursday, which was unusual because Niels Moen came by on no particular schedule and rarely without a reason that benefited Niels Moen. He was a neighbor to the east, a man with a straight back and a practical mind and the kind of doubt that presented itself as concern. He was not cruel. He was careful, and careful men find reasons not to help before they find reasons to try. He found Oddmund in the side lot measuring willow rods against the space between potato rows. Kittel held one end of a rod. Oddmund held the other with his good arm and squinted along the length. Niels watched for a full minute before speaking. He said, "You are building something." Oddmund said, "I am measuring something. Building comes after." Niels looked at the potato rows, looked at the ducks behind the hurdle, and assembled the picture in his mind. His face did not change, but his weight shifted backward, which was the body's way of saying no before the mouth caught up. He said, "Ducks eat grain. Beetles eat leaves. Where is the profit in putting one near the other?" Oddmund said, "The profit is that ducks also eat beetles." Niels pressed the real question, the one that mattered. He said, "And if they eat the plants?" Oddmund did not argue. He walked to the hurdle, opened the gate, and let one duck into the work area. Not Mart, but a young bird with clear eyes and a nervous step. He cut one potato leaf and laid it on the ground beside 3 beetles he had picked from the nearest row. He covered all of it with a wooden pail, placed the duck beside the pail, and lifted the edge. The duck's head went under. The bill swept left, right, left. 3 beetles taken in 4 seconds. The leaf mouthed once, turned, dropped. The duck stepped back and waited. Niels looked at the leaf on the ground. It was damp from the duck's bill, but whole. He looked at the duck. He looked at Oddmund. He said, "1 duck, 1 leaf, 3 bugs." "That is not a field. That is a trick," Oddmund said. "Then I will need 60 tricks working every morning and every evening for 8 weeks. Niels laughed, not from cruelty, from disbelief. The math was so lopsided, the picture so strange, that laughter was the only tool his mind could find. He left with his doubt intact and his curiosity just barely hooked, like a fish that has mouthed the bait but not yet turned. That hook was enough. Oddmund did not need Niels to believe. He needed Niels to watch. A man who watches long enough eventually sees. The mockery did not wait for evidence. It moved through the settlement faster than the beetles moved through the potato rows, and it traveled the same way, from one mouth to the next, multiplying as it went. At Kark's store, where men gathered to buy supplies and trade gossip that served the same function as supplies, the phrase 60 blind ducks became a sentence, then a story, then a verdict. The storekeeper himself fed it. Reuben Kark stood behind his counter with Paris green stacked on the shelf behind him, tins and paper sacks printed with skull and crossbones that he sold on credit to every farmer who asked, and he said things loud enough for the room to carry home. "Some men buy poison," Kark said. "Some men buy feed for failures." He pinned a newspaper advertisement for potato bug killer next to the scale and let the men read it while they waited for their orders. The advertisement showed a healthy field, bright green, not a beetle in sight. Underneath, modern science for modern farms. Kark did not need to say anything else. The advertisement said it for him. What Kark did not say, what he did not need to say because every man in the room already knew, was that Paris green on credit meant a crop lien, and a crop lien meant Kark owned a piece of every potato before it came out of the ground. If a farmer defaulted, Kark took first claim on the stored harvest. It was not charity. It was not even business in the way that fair dealing is business. It was leverage disguised as help, and it worked because the alternative was watching your children go hungry while beetles ate your future. Kark offered Paris green to Odman publicly. He did it on a Saturday when the store was full, and he did it with terms designed to humiliate the cropland. The store debt of $38 rolled in, a promise that if Odman defaulted, Kark would take first claim on the root cellar, and a clause, spoken casually as if it were reasonable, that Odmund would reduce his flock to 20 birds, because as Kark said, a man who feeds 60 beaks when his grandchildren are thin is not thinking clearly. Odmund refused. He said no, and he said it without elaboration, which was worse than an argument because it gave Kark nothing to push against. A man who argues can be worn down. A man who says no and walks out leaves the room wondering what he knows that they do not. The refusal cost Odmund more than pride. Parents told children to stay away from the break-a-place. The old man is turning simple, they said, which was the prairie's way of saying someone had stopped following the rules that everyone else followed, and therefore could not be trusted. Eli heard this at school. She did not repeat it at home, but she stopped asking to visit friends, and the silence where invitation should have been was louder than the insult. Kittle fought a boy who called his grandfather duck blind. The fight lasted 30 seconds and ended with Kittle's lip split against a fence post and the other boy running. The school teacher, Marte Flatin, sent Kittel home with a cloth pressed to his mouth and a look that was not anger but something worse. The careful expression of a woman who wanted to ask whether there was food in the house and knew the answer would be a lie. She asked anyway. She came to the gate that afternoon and spoke to Odmund directly. "Is there food in the house?" Odmund said yes. The lie tasted like the thin soup he had boiled that morning from the last onion and a potato too soft for anything else. Marte Flatten looked at him. She looked at Kittle's lip. She looked at the ducks behind the hurdles and the willow rods stacked beside the barn and the rows of young potatoes stretching toward the horizon. And she said nothing more, because she understood that a man's pride was the last thing between him and the kind of help that comes with conditions. She left, but she would come back, and what she brought would matter more than grain. Professor Beck returned 10 days after his first visit. Odmund did not know why. Perhaps the college required follow-up reports. Perhaps Beck wanted to confirm his prediction. Perhaps, and this was the possibility Odmund entertained only at night when doubt ran free. The professor was curious despite himself. Beck found Odmund staking willow lanes between the first acre of potatoes. 6 hurdles were finished, leaning against the fence, each one 5 feet long and 30 inches tall, woven from creek willow with the bark still on. They looked like something between garden fencing and a child's fort. They did not look like agricultural science. Beck walked the row. He examined a hurdle. He pushed it with one finger and watched it flex. He looked at the spacing Odmund had measured between the rows and the gap left for duck passage, and the small stakes driven at intervals to anchor the panels against wind. He said, "You are serious." Odmund said, "I was serious before you came. Your visit did not change the arithmetic." Beck had the grace to hear the correction. He bent down and turned a potato leaf. The underside showed 3 clusters of orange eggs, each cluster holding 12 to 15 eggs packed tight as fish roe. He scraped one cluster into his palm and counted. A beetle hatch is arithmetic, Beck said. You cannot answer arithmetic with sentiment. Odman reached into his coat and produced a glass jar. Inside were 112 beetles and larvae, collected that morning from a single practice pass along the field edge. He had sent one team of 12 ducks down a 30-yard strip beside the fence and counted what their droppings in the shake cloth revealed. Then we will count, Odman said. Beck took the jar. He held it to the light. He counted. His lips moved, and his expression shifted from dismissal to something harder to read. Not belief, not yet, but the discomfort of a man whose framework has been handed evidence it cannot easily file. He said, Edge rows collect beetles from the grass margin. The center of the field is where the real hatch lives. One strip along a fence proves nothing about 6 acres. He was right. And he was also afraid of being wrong, which made him more dangerous than Kark, because Kark's opposition came from greed, but Beck's came from the place where a man's professional identity meets a fact that does not fit. Beck left without offering his sprayer. He left without offering credit. He left with the image of 112 insects in a jar, and that image would follow him back to the college and sit in his notes until the harvest forced him to return. That night, Odman boiled soup from oats and the last dried turnip. Kittle ate without complaint because complaint required energy he was saving for morning chores. Eli ate half her portion, and then, when she thought her grandfather was not watching, carried her potato piece to the step where one of the blind ducks, old Marte, white and cloudy-eyed, had followed her and was tapping the boards with her bill. Odman saw it. He opened his mouth to stop her. A child should not give food to a bird when the child is hungry. But he saw Eli's face. The girl was not feeding a pet. She was feeding the thing her grandfather believed in, because at 10 years old she understood that belief was the only currency the family had left. And if the ducks were Odman's bet on winner, then keeping one duck alive on one potato piece was the smallest investment she could make in not being hungry in December. Odman closed his mouth. He stood in the doorway and watched his granddaughter feed a blind bird in the evening light, and he understood something he had been trying to articulate since the grain sack tour. The ducks were not pets. They were not livestock in the way that chickens or cattle were livestock. They were the last working tool he owned. Every other tool required strength he did not have, money he could not spend, or help that would not come. The ducks required only what he had always given them: attention, grain, water, and the belief that a creature does not need perfect eyes to do perfect work. He went to bed with the jar of 112 beetles on the windowsill, and the sound of 60 ducks settling in the yard, and the knowledge that in the morning he would begin cutting willow in earnest, because the beetle eggs under the leaves were hatching on a schedule that did not care about his shoulder, his debt, his neighbors, or the professional opinion of a man from the agricultural college. The beetles were coming. The poison was waiting on Kark's shelf. And between those two facts, Odman Breka was building a narrow road of woven sticks for birds that could not see to walk. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? The first hurdle went into the field the next morning. Kittle carried one end, Odman the other, and they dropped it between the first and second row with the care of men laying a beam across a river. The willow flexed against the potato stems, but did not crush them. The spacing held. 22 inches, measured with a stick Odman had notched and carried in his belt. One hurdle, 5 feet of guided path. Enough for 12 ducks to walk single file between 2 rows of potatoes without stepping on the hills. Odman stood at one end of the lane. He looked down its length. The morning light came low across the field, and the potato leaves threw small shadows on the turned soil, and somewhere under those leaves the beetle eggs were darkening toward the red of hatching larvae. He had 5 acres and 6 days of good weather left before the first full hatch. He needed 24 hurdles to cover 1 acre at a time. He needed water pans built from salvaged tin. He needed feed calculated to the scoop. He needed his grandchildren trained to guide 12 ducks through a living field without panic, without striking, without crushing a single hill that held the potatoes his family would eat in January. He had 1 hurdle, 1 bad shoulder, and a letter from a woman named Beret Vangen that he had not yet answered. Kittel looked at the single hurdle in the vast field and said, "How many more?" Odmund said, 23 for the first acre. More for the rest. Kittel looked at the willow pile by the creek. He looked at his hands. He looked at his grandfather's shoulder. He said, "We should start cutting." They started cutting. The willow was green and fought the blade. Odmund's shoulder locked after every 3rd stroke, and he had to stop, breathe, rotate the joint until the grinding eased and start again. Kittel cut faster, but wove slower, and the first panel he finished alone was crooked enough that a duck would have turned sideways to pass. They worked through the morning. By noon, they had 3 more hurdles. By dusk, 5. The potato leaves were growing. The beetle eggs were growing. And somewhere between the creek and the field, in the gap between what Odmund had built and what he needed, the summer was burning toward a hatch that would not wait for Willow to bend. He had not yet written to Beret Vangen. He had not yet solved the feed problem. He had not yet tested a full team in a full row. And the worst part, the part he did not say to Kittel as they leaned the hurdles against the barn in fading light, was that even if every piece worked perfectly, 6 acres was more ground than 60 ducks could cover before the larvae stripped the leaves faster than bills could find them. He needed help. The help he needed lived 15 miles east, and the letter he should have written 6 years ago was still folded in a trunk beside his dead wife's wedding cloth. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he would write. But tomorrow the beetles would be one day closer to hatching, and the willow by the creek would be one day harder to cut, and the children would be one day hungrier, and Reuben Kark would be one day more certain that the old Norwegian with the blind ducks would break before winter and come crawling to the counter with his pride in his hat and his crop on a lean. Tomorrow was not a plan. Tomorrow was a prayer wearing work clothes. Odmund went inside, sat at the table, and began to write. The letter reached Beret Vangen on a Tuesday. The reply came on a Thursday. Not a letter, but a mule pulling a narrow wagon through Odmund's gate at mid-morning, carrying a woman of 62, who looked like she had been carved from the same wood as the hurdles leaning against his barn. Beret Vangen was not tall. She was not soft. She had hands that moved with the certainty of someone who had spent 40 years handling animals that did not care about her opinions, and her face held the permanent squint of a person who looked at the world the way a carpenter looks at a board, measuring it for what it could become, not admiring what it was. She climbed down from the wagon without help. She looked at the ducks behind the hurdles. She looked at the potato rows. She looked at Odmund's shoulder, the way it dropped an inch lower than the other, and she said nothing about it because she understood that naming a weakness in front of a proud man was the same as taking a tool from his hand. She had brought 2 sacks of cracked oats, a bundle of willow rods already peeled and sorted by thickness, and a notebook wrapped in oilcloth. The notebook was small, no bigger than a hymnal, and the pages inside were filled with marks in pencil and ink. Feeding schedules, hatch dates, breeding records, mortality counts, and hand-drawn diagrams of duck pens that looked like battlefield maps. Odmund said, "You came fast." Beret said, "I came because you asked the right question, not will ducks eat beetles. Any fool knows that. You asked how to make them work." She untied the oat sacks and carried one on her hip to the duck pen, walking past Kittle without introduction, because introduction was a luxury she had no interest in paying for. She opened the pen gate. 60 ducks surged toward her. She stood still and let them press against her legs, and she watched. She watched the way a judge watches a race. Not the leaders, but the stragglers. Not the bold ones, but the cautious ones. Not the birds with clear eyes, but the birds with cloudy eyes, who navigated the press of bodies by feel rather than sight. After 2 minutes, she said, "The old white one, the one tilting her head. She is your best worker." Odmund said, "Marte." The children named her. Beret said, "Marte does not need a name. She needs a job." That was the beginning, not of friendship, because Beret did not trade in friendship. The beginning of a partnership built on the understanding that respect is not warmth. It is the willingness to correct someone you believe is capable of learning. Beret's first lesson was about hurdles, and it began with demolition. She walked the row where Odmund's 6 completed panels stood between potato plants. She pushed the 3rd panel with her knee. It bowed inward. She pushed the 5th. The willow rods were too thin at the base, and the weave was too tight, which made the panel rigid where it should flex and weak where it should hold. She said, "These will trap ducks, not guide them. A trapped duck panics. A panicking duck crushes plants. You will kill your own crop with good intentions." Kittle, who had woven the 5th panel alone, flushed red to his ears. He started to speak, and Beret cut him off. She did not cut him off with words. She cut him off by pulling the panel apart with her hands, separating the rods, and laying them on the ground in order of thickness. "Thick rods for the uprights," she said. "Thin rods for the cross weave. The weave must be open enough that a duck can see through it. Even a cloudy-eyed duck sees light and shadow through gaps. If the wall is solid, the bird thinks it is a pen wall and stops. If the wall has gaps, the bird sees the lane continues and moves forward." She rebuilt the panel in 15 minutes. The new version was lighter, more flexible, and open enough that the potato leaves poked through the gaps without bending. She made Kittle rebuild the crooked 5th panel. He did it wrong. She made him rebuild it again. He did it wrong differently. She made him rebuild it a 3rd time, and this time she stood behind him and said nothing until he finished. And when he finished, she pressed the panel with her knee, and it held. "Good," she said. "Now make 17 more." The second lesson was about hunger balance, and it came the next morning at dawn. Beret stood beside the feed trough with Odmund's grain scoop in her hand. She turned the scoop over and studied it the way Beck had studied beetle eggs, not with contempt, but with the focused irritation of a professional examining amateur work. "This scoop has no marks," she said. "You feed by feel?" Odmund said, "I feed by knowing the birds." Beret said, "You feed by guessing, and guessing makes fat ducks. A fat duck walks through beetles the way a full man walks through a market. He sees the food. He does not stop." She took a knife from her belt and cut notches into the wooden scoop handle. 1 notch. The ration for old birds before dawn. 2 notches. The ration for young workers after the pass. 3 notches. The evening mash reward that brought every bird back to the pen. "Sharp, not starved," she said. "A duck must want to forage. Want, not need. If the bird is frantic, she tears at everything. Leaves, stems, soil. If the bird is satisfied, she ignores what her bill finds. The line between sharp and starved is 1 notch on a scoop, and you have been feeding 2 notches past it." Odmund listened. He did not argue, because arguing with a woman who had raised ducks for 40 years would be the same as arguing with the ducks themselves. A waste of breath that changed nothing. The 3rd lesson came in the afternoon, and it changed everything about the blind birds. Beret walked to the duck pen and looked at the water pans Odmund had set out. Shallow tin plates, the kind used under flower pots, filled with an inch of water that turned brown within an hour. She said, "A duck with a dirty bill is a blind man wearing mittens." She emptied the shallow pans, went to the barn, and came back with a deeper trough she had found under the workbench. She filled it with clean water from the pump and set it inside the pen. The ducks came to it immediately. The blind birds found it by sound, the splash of others drinking, and plunged their bills to the nostrils. "Watch," Beret said. The ducks lifted their heads. Water ran from their bills and nostrils. They shook, spraying droplets. The blind birds dipped again, working their bills open and shut underwater, flushing mud and dried matter from the edges where the nerve-rich tissue pressed against every surface. She said, "Deep enough to rinse nostrils, deep enough to clean the nail edges. Set water every 40 yards in the field. Every 40 yards, not 60, not 80. A duck that walks 60 yards with a clogged bill misses half the beetles in the last 20. She set 4 deep tins across the first acre that afternoon. She made Eli fill them, and she watched Eli carry water from the pump in a bucket too heavy for her arms, and she said nothing about the weight, because she understood that a child doing difficult work was a child learning that survival is not handed down from above. The 4th lesson was about timing, and it came with a warning. Bray walked the potato rows at dusk and pressed her thumb against the stems. She checked the soil moisture at the base of each hill. She turned leaves and counted beetle egg clusters the way other women counted stitches in knitting, automatically, without breaking her attention from the larger pattern. She said, "When the stems are wet after hard rain, no flock enters. A wet stem snaps under a duck's breast. A snapped stem kills the tuber below. You wait, even if the beetles are feeding, you wait until the stem's dry enough to flex, and then you send the first team through the row, middles only. Hill shoulders after the tubers set. Never before," Odmund said. "And if the beetles eat the leaves while I wait?" Beret looked at him. She said, "Then you lose some leaves. You do not lose the hill. A plant with damaged leaves can still feed a tuber if the root holds. A plant with a broken stem is dead standing up. Choose your losses." It was not comfort, it was triage, and triage was the only medicine that worked on a field where the enemy bred faster than the cure could walk. The days pressed forward, each one shorter than the one before, though the calendar said otherwise. Time on a farm under siege does not move by hours. It moves by tasks remaining, and the list grew faster than Odmund could cross items off. Week 1. 6 new hurdles finished, bringing the total to 12. Enough for half an acre. Beret's willow rods wove faster than the creek willow Odmund had been cutting, but the creek willow was free, and Beret's supply was finite. Kittle cut willow every morning before breakfast, and his hands blistered and hardened and blistered again in layers that his grandmother Sigri would have wrapped in cloth, but that Beret ignored because calluses were the only payment she expected from children. Week 2. 24 hurdles completed. 2 water sleds built from scrap boards, low platforms with tins nailed on top that could be dragged between rows by Eli without tipping. 1 holding pen constructed from old fence rails at the field's east end where duck teams would stage before entering the lanes. Week 3. 4 duck teams trained to respond to a bell. Beret used a small brass bell, the kind hung on a goat's neck, and she rang it at feeding time until the ducks associated the sound with mash. Then she rang it in the field, and the teams turned toward the sound. Then she rang patterns. 1 ring meant forward, 2 rings meant water, 3 rings meant recall to the pen. The blind birds learned fastest because they had been listening to bells their entire lives, while sighted birds relied on watching others. The old cloudy-eyed ducks became the anchors of each team, the birds that responded to sound while the young birds responded to movement. Marte, the white blind duck, became the leader of the first team through no decision of Oddman's. She simply walked to the front whenever the bell rang once, and the other 11 birds followed because she moved with a certainty that had nothing to do with seeing where she was going and everything to do with knowing. Week 4. The eggs under the leaves began to darken. The orange clusters turned rusty, then red, and then the first larvae emerged, soft, red, humped, crawling from the egg mass to the leaf edge and beginning to eat. Oddman counted larvae on 10 leaves across his field. The average was 14 per leaf on the south-facing rows where the sun warmed the eggs fastest. 14 larvae per leaf, dozens of leaves per plant, hundreds of plants per row, 30 rows per acre, 6 acres. The numbers were a wave building offshore. He could see it coming. He could hear it. He could not stop it. He could only put his ducks in its path and trust that what Beret had taught him, and what his mother had shown him, and what Marte's bill had proven in the dust of a torn grain sack would hold when the wave hit. But the wave was not the only thing coming. Setbacks arrived in clusters, the way trouble always does on a farm where margins do not exist. A thunderstorm on a Wednesday night flattened 3 hurdle lanes and drove standing water into the low end of the second acre. Oddman and Kittle spent Thursday resetting panels in mud that sucked at their boots and would not release the stakes. Oddman's shoulder seized twice. The second time he dropped to one knee in the row middle and stayed there for a full minute, breathing through his nose while Kittle pretended to adjust a stake so he would not have to watch his grandfather fail to stand. A stray dog from the Halvorsen place broke through the holding pen fence on a Friday night and killed 2 young ducks before Eli's screaming drove it off. 2 birds lost from 60. The math barely changed. The feeling changed completely. Eli held a dead duck with blood on her nightgown and would not let go until Beret took it from her hands and said, "Grieve in the morning. Work now. Fix the fence." Kark refused to sell cracked grain for anything but cash. Oddmund had no cash. The ducks needed feed to stay sharp. Beret offered to buy grain from her own supply, but her wagon was 15 miles east and the mule was slow. Oddmund calculated days. 3 days for Beret to ride home, load grain, and return. 3 days during which the ducks would eat from a diminishing pile of oats, and if the pile ran out, the birds would either weaken or forage unsupervised and damage the rows they were supposed to save. Eli's cough returned after the cold rain. Not the dry cough of dust and wind, but the wet cough of something settling in her chest. Oddman heard it at night through the wall. He boiled water with dried herbs and made her breathe the steam, and he said nothing about doctors because doctors cost money, and money was a word that had stopped meaning anything in this house except the absence of itself. And then, on a morning when the larvae count had doubled overnight, and the first potato leaves showed scalloped edges where the feeding had begun, Marte Flatten arrived at the gate with a sack. The sack contained sweepings from the schoolhouse grain bin, spilled oats, cracked wheat, barley dust, collected over weeks and saved in a flour sack that smelled of chalk and children. It was enough feed for 4 days, maybe 5 if Beret's notch system held. Marte said the sack was for arithmetic lessons. She said she wanted Oddman to teach her how to count beetle egg clusters because she intended to include agricultural observation in her classroom and needed a practical example. It was the most generous lie anyone had told in Steele County that spring. Oddman accepted it with the same gravity he would have accepted a lie from a minister, gratefully, silently, and without testing its edges. Marte stayed through the morning. She watched Beret guide a cloudy-eyed duck through a test trough filled with damp soil and hidden barley kernels. The duck's bill swept the trough in systematic arcs, clearing every kernel from under clods and pebble and leaf litter. Marte counted. 23 kernels found in 90 seconds. Not one missed. Kark appeared at the fence. He had walked from the road, which meant he had come deliberately, not by chance. He stood with two men, farmers who owed him money, and therefore stood where he stood. And he watched Beret with the duck in the trough and the look on Marte Flatten's face, and he laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Worse, a patient laugh. The laugh of a man who has seen foolishness before and knows that time, not argument, will prove him right. A trick bird will not save a field, Kark said. Beret did not look at him. She kept her hand on the duck's back and guided it to the end of the trough, where the last 3 kernels hid under a clump of wet soil. The duck found all 3. No, Beret said. 60 ordinary ones might. Beck returned one more time before the hatch. He said he wanted to inspect his demonstration plots on neighboring farms, but he walked Oddman's rows with his notebook open and his pencil moving. He counted beetle eggs per leaf, measured plant height, recorded soil temperature by pressing a thermometer into the hill shoulder. He did not speak to Oddman. He spoke to his notebook. But when he reached the east end of the field, where the hurdle lanes were stacked and the holding pen held 12 ducks waiting for their morning pass, he stopped and watched. Oddmund released the first team. Beret rang one bell. The ducks moved into the lane, Marte at the front, 3 cloudy-eyed birds in the middle, 8 young workers flanking. They walked between the rows with their heads low and their bills working. The sound was soft, persistent, alive. Tap, sweep, the rhythm of 60 nerve-filled bills reading the ground the way fingers read a page. Beck watched for 11 minutes. He recorded something in his notebook. He left without speaking. What he wrote, Oddman would not learn until autumn, but the fact that he wrote anything at all meant the jar of 112 beetles had done its work. The professor was no longer certain. An uncertainty in a man who had built his career on certainty was the first crack in a wall that would eventually fall. The hatch came in late June, not gradually, not a slow increase that gave farmers time to organize. It came the way a dam breaks. One day the leaves showed egg clusters and scattered larvae, and the next day the larvae were everywhere, red and humped, and feeding in bands that turned green leaves to lace. Farmers along the Hope Road dusted Paris green from cans and hand-pumped sprayers. The white-green powder settled on wet leaves and killed what it touched. For 3 days the method looked like salvation. Beck's demonstration plot showed clean leaves. Kark sold his entire first shipment and wired for more. Oddman began controlled passes at dawn. 12 ducks entered the first acre through the west end lane. Bills swept soil, stems, leaf litter. The blind birds did not lag. They worked slower but more thoroughly, probing the loose hills where larvae had dropped to pupate, finding beetles in crevices that Kittle's eyes missed at arm's length. The first morning's count, 386 larvae, and adults recovered from droppings and shake claws across 1 acre. Plant damage, 11 broken stems, all on one turn where Kittle had crowded the flock by standing too close to the lane end. Oddman said nothing. Beret said, "Stand back 5 feet. The birds know the lane. You do not need to herd them into it." Second pass, 2 days later. Beetle count in the first acre down by half. The potato leaves showed feeding damage, scalloped edges, holes in the centers, but the leaves were still green, still working, still feeding the tubers underground. Untreated neighbor rows showed ragged leaves by the 3rd day. Niels Moen's field, dusted twice, looked clean on top, but showed larvae climbing back from the soil after each rain softened the poison coat. Beck's demonstration plot held, But Beck had the luxury of treating a quarter acre with precision that no working farmer could replicate across a full field. Niels Moen came to the fence. He did not laugh. He watched the ducks work a row and said, "They find them under the leaves." Oddmund said, "They find them everywhere." Niels said nothing else, but he stayed for 20 minutes, and when he left, he walked slowly, which was the body's way of thinking. The storm came on the 9th of July. It did not announce itself the way winter storms do, with falling pressure and a sky that turns the color of iron. It came from the west in the afternoon as a wall of black cloud that swallowed the horizon in 20 minutes. Lightning hit the open prairie and strikes so close together the thunder became continuous. Then the rain. Not rain. Water dropped from the sky in sheets so thick that standing in it felt like standing under a poured bucket. It fell for 6 hours. It fell through the night. It fell through the next morning. 3 days of rain that turned fields into mud and roads into creeks and low spots into ponds where potato hills dissolved into brown soup. The rain washed Paris green from every leaf in the county. 3 days of dusting gone in 3 hours. The white-green powder ran into furrows, pooled in low spots, soaked into soil where it would persist for years, but where it could no longer touch the beetles climbing back up the stems. Farmers who had spent their credit on poison watched the rain take it and understood that they had bought time, not protection, and the time was now spent. When the sun returned on the 4th day, the beetles climbed. Larvae that had sheltered under soil clods and leaf litter emerged in bands so thick that stems turned red with their bodies. The feeding was audible, not a sound any single insect made, but the collective whisper of thousands of tiny mouths working green tissue, a sound like paper being torn slowly and continuously in a room where no one speaks. Neighbor fields turned ragged within 48 hours. Leaves that had been whole before the storm showed skeleton veins where the tissue had been eaten away. Plants that had been heading toward bloom stopped growing. The tubers underground, starved of the food that leaves were supposed to make, sat small and pale and would not swell. Cark's second shipment of Paris green was delayed. A rail washout east of Jamestown stopped the freight. Farmers came to his store and found empty shelves where the tins had been. Cark promised delivery in a week. A week was a lifetime when larvae doubled their feeding every 2 days. Oddmund's field was now both his greatest hope and his greatest danger. The rain had softened the soil, which meant duckbills could probe deeper and easier than before. But the rain had also softened the hills, which meant duck feet could break through the mounded earth and expose tubers to light and rot. And the rain had knocked hurdle panels sideways, filled water tins with mud, and turned the lanes into tracks that needed resetting before any team could pass. Beret wanted 4 short passes spread across the day. Oddman wanted 6. They argued in the yard at dawn while the rain dripped from the barn eaves and the beetles climbed in the field and the children watched from the doorway because they had learned that when Beret and Oddman raised their voices, something important was being decided. Beret said, 4 passes. Short. Rest between. The soil is too soft for more. You will break hills. Oddman said, 6. The hatch is too heavy. 4 passes will not keep ahead. Beret said, and if you lose an acre of hills to save the leaves, what have you gained? Oddman said, leaves. Without leaves, there are no tubers at all. They agreed on 5. It was not a compromise. It was the number that emerged when 2 people who were both afraid chose the fear they could better survive. Eli woke feverish. Her cough had deepened overnight into something that rattled when she breathed, and her forehead was hot enough that Marte Flatten, who had come at dawn to help with the lanes, pressed her hand to the girl's skin and said only, she needs to be inside. Marte stayed with Eli. She boiled water. She made Eli drink broth from the last jar in the cellar. She did what Oddman could not do because Oddman was in the field, and the field would not wait for a child's fever to break. Kittle moved hurdles alone. He dragged one panel through the mud of the second acre, slipped on a wet hill shoulder, and caught himself with his right hand on a fence stake. The stake drove a splinter deep into the cut he had gotten the week before, and the cut opened like a mouth and bled through the rag he had tied around it. He did not stop. He wrapped the rag tighter and kept dragging. Oddman saw the blood from 3 rows away and said nothing, because saying something would require stopping, and stopping would require choosing between his grandson's hand and the larvae eating his future. Beret took command of the flock. She did not ask. She walked to the holding pen, picked up the bell, and said to Oddmund, "You built the road. Now trust the birds." First light, the western acre. Beret rang 1 bell. 12 ducks entered the lane, Marte in the lead, 4 cloudy-eyed birds in the middle, 7 young workers flanking. The lane was wet. Standing water pooled in the low spots between hills. The ducks hesitated at the first puddle, bunching at the entrance the way people bunch at a doorway when no one wants to go first. Marte did not hesitate. She lowered her bill into the standing water and began working. Tap, sweep, tap. She moved forward. The others followed because following the bird in front is what ducks do when they cannot decide for themselves, and Marty had decided. The bills found larvae on leaf undersides. They found beetles in puddle rims where the insects had washed from higher ground. They found pupae in loosened soil near hill shoulders where the rain had softened the crust. The ducks worked like sewing needles, precise, repetitive, relentless, and behind them the row showed damaged leaves and mud-tracked soil, but living plants still attached to hills that held. Second acre. The hurdle that Kittle had reset was not seated properly. Its base shifted as the 4th duck passed, and the panel fell inward across 2 potato hills. The next 8 ducks surged through the gap toward the tender plants of the 3rd row. Kittle threw himself into the gap. He landed on his stomach in the mud between the rows and spread his arms, and the ducks hit his body and bounced off like water hitting a stone. 3 birds turned back. 2 scrambled over his legs. 3 pressed against his ribs. Oddmund reached the broken hurdle and lifted it with his left arm, his right arm hanging useless because the shoulder had ground through whatever cartilage remained and found bone. He held the panel one-handed while Kittle crawled out from under the ducks and restaked the base. The pain went from Oddman's shoulder to his jaw. He tasted metal. He did not let go of the hurdle until Kittle hammered the stake and the panel held. Beret rang 2 bells. Water. The ducks turned toward the nearest tin. They drank, cleaned their bills, shook the mud from their nostrils. Beret counted the birds. All 12 present. She counted the broken stems. 7. Fewer than she had feared. She looked at Oddmund, who was standing with his right arm pressed against his body, and she said, "3rd acre is ready." 3rd acre. Thunder returned from the west, not the 3-day storm again, but a fast-moving squall that threw wind across the field and pressed the potato leaves flat. The ducks bunched. When runner ducks are frightened, they stand tall and press their bodies together, and a frightened group in a narrow lane becomes a wall of feathers that cannot move forward or backward. Beret rang the bell. Steady, steady, steady. 1 ring, pause. 1 ring, pause. The rhythm was a heartbeat, and the ducks responded to it the way a child responds to a mother's hand, not with understanding, but with trust. The old blind birds turned toward the sound first because they had been listening to bells longer than they had been seeing, and their movement broke the cluster. The young birds followed. The team reformed and moved down the lane while wind flattened the potato leaves around them and thunder cracked above, and Beret stood at the row end with the bell in her hand and did not flinch. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because what happens in the next few minutes decides whether that family eats through winter. Fourth acre, fifth acre. The ducks worked through the afternoon in rotating teams while oddmen tracked counts on a shingle with charcoal. The numbers were enormous, hundreds per acre, thousands across the field. The droppings were dark with beetle chitin. The shake cloths showed larvae of every size, newly hatched red nubs, fat middle-stage grubs, even adults that the ducks had cornered against hill shoulders and taken head first. But the numbers meant nothing next to what was happening on Niels Moen's farm. Niels's wife, Randy, was hand-picking beetles into tin cups. She had been picking for 2 days. The cups filled, and she emptied them into a bucket. And the bucket filled, and she emptied it into a pit. And the pit filled. And the beetles kept coming because hand-picking from a full-hatch field was like bailing a boat with a teacup. Her back ached. Her fingers were stained yellow-green from crushed larvae, and her daughter, Guro, was lying on the kitchen floor. Guro was 7. She had eaten bread with hands that had touched a flour sack used to cut Paris green. The sack had sat near the food shelf because the Moen house was small, and storage was not a luxury it could afford. The powder had transferred from sack to fingers to bread, in amounts too small to see and too large to ignore. The child vomited first, then her skin went pale. Then she complained that her stomach burned, and Randy found the flour sack and understood and started scrubbing the girl's hands with water and lye soap, while Niels rode for the doctor, who lived 9 miles south and might not be home. Beck arrived at the Moen place before the doctor did. He saw the sack. He saw the child. He looked at his own hands, which had handled Paris green in demonstrations for 8 years, and his face went the color of the paste he had been mixing that morning. He said the powder was safe when used properly. He said the sack should not have been stored near food. He said the concentration in flour-cut mixtures was low enough that casual contact was not dangerous for adults. He said every correct thing, and every correct thing sounded like a lie spoken over a sick child. Guro survived. The dose was small enough, but the image, a mother washing green-tinged dust from a 7-year-old's fingers while the father rode for a doctor who might not come, that image traveled through the settlement faster than any argument about beetles or ducks or poison. It traveled because every family in the county had a Paris green sack somewhere in their house, and every family had children, and the line between somewhere and near the food was measured in inches that no one had bothered to count. The 6th acre was too wet. The rain had pooled in the low end, and the hills were soft enough that Oddman could push his thumb through the mounded earth to the tuber beneath. Sending ducks through that soil would be sending them to dig potatoes out of the ground with their feet. He nearly quit. The sun was dropping. His shoulder had stopped hurting, which was worse than pain because it meant the joint had gone numb and might not work in the morning. Kittle's hand was swollen around the bandage. Eli was coughing in the house. And the 6th acre, the last acre, the acre that would decide whether the harvest numbers added up to survival or just to something close, sat under an inch of standing water with larvae crawling up every stem. Beret pointed to the holding pen. The remaining ducks, the ones that had not worked that day because Oddman was rationing their energy, stood at the gate. Among them were the oldest birds, the nearly blind ones, the ones the neighbors called failures, and Cart called pensioners, and Oddman called by the names his grandchildren had given them. She said, "They are not finished." Odman looked at the wet field. He looked at the old birds. He said, "The hills will not hold." Barrett said, "Then use the row middles only." "Not the hills. Send them down the center of the path where the water runs. The larvae that wash down are sitting in the runoff. The birds will not need to climb the hills. They will work the gutter." It was not in the plan. The plan said 5 acres. The plan said stop before dark. The plan said protect the hills above all else. But the plan had been written before the storm, and the storm had rewritten everything, and the only plan that mattered now was the one that answered the single question: will there be enough green leaf left tomorrow for the tubers to keep growing? Odman rang the bell. One ring. The old birds came through the gate. Marte first, always first, and entered the narrow gutter between the last 2 rows. No hurdles, no lane, just the natural path that water and gravity had carved between the potato hills, a trench 4 inches deep and full of runoff and larvae and mud. The blind ducks walked that trench the way other birds walk a lane. Bill down, sweep left, sweep right, tap, probe, take. The larvae in the runoff had nowhere to hide. The mud was thin enough for bills to penetrate. The ducks moved slowly, old legs, old joints, cloudy eyes that saw nothing but felt everything, and behind them the trench was clean. Odman stood at the end of the row in the last light. His shoulder hung dead. His boots were full of water. His grandson was bleeding through a rag. His granddaughter was coughing behind a closed door. And in front of him, in a flooded potato field where every method except his had been washed away by 3 days of rain, 8 old ducks with bad eyes were doing the only work that still mattered. He counted until the numbers lost meaning. He stopped counting and watched. The potato leaves above the trench were damaged, chewed, ragged at the edges, bent by storm and browsed by beetles. But they were alive. The stems were cracked in places, but standing. The hills were soft, but whole. The field was not clean. It was not healthy. It was not anything a professor would photograph for a bulletin. It was living. And in Steele County, in July of 1906, living was enough. Beret rang 3 bells. Recall. The old ducks turned and walked back toward the pen. Marte last this time, sweeping the trench one final pass as she went, finding 3 more larvae that every other bird had missed. Odman watched her come through the gate. He leaned against the fence post because his legs had stopped being reliable an hour ago. He said nothing to Beret. She said nothing to him. They stood in the yard while the light went out of the sky and the ducks settled into the pen, and the sound of 60 bills tapping against water tins filled the silence where words would have been useless. The potatoes would grow or they would not. The tubers would swell or they would not. The larvae that the ducks had missed would eat what they could find, and the leaves that survived would feed what they could feed, and the whole betier, the willow lanes, the bell code, the feeding notches, the blind birds in the center of every team, would not be proven right or wrong until a fork went into the ground in September and either found potatoes or found nothing. But tonight, for the first time since the wagon had turned south with his grain sack still in its bed, Odman Breka believed the bet was not lost. He went inside. He sat beside Eli. He held a cup of water to her mouth and listened to her breathe. And the breathing was rough but steady, and steady was the only word that meant anything in this house tonight. The weeks between July and September moved the way water moves through soil, invisible, essential, and impossible to rush. Odman could not see what was happening underground. Nobody could. The tubers were either swelling in the dark beneath damaged but living leaves, or they were sitting pale and small and starving, because the leaves above them had lost too much tissue to feed them. The answer was in the dirt, and the dirt would not speak until a fork went in. Oddman continued the passes, 5 teams rotating through 6 acres, morning and dusk, through July and August. The beetle pressure eased as the season turned, fewer larvae hatching, adults slowing in the cooling air, pupae dropping deep into soil where bills could still find them, but in smaller numbers. The potato leaves looked rough, chewed edges, storm-bent stems, mud-tracked rows that any professor would have marked as compromised. The plants were not beautiful. They were working. Neighbors' fields told a different story. The families who had relied on Paris green and lost it to the rain spent August hand-picking and watching leaves thin. Niels Moen's 6 acres produced plants that looked clean on top. The second dusting had caught the late-season adults, but the early damage from the post-storm hatch had already stolen weeks of growth. The tubers underground had started late and would finish small. Nobody spoke about it. Farmers do not announce failure before harvest. They wait, and they hope, and they sharpen their forks, and they dig. September. The air turned dry. The potato tops browned and fell, the way they do when the plant has finished its work, and the tubers below have taken everything the leaves could give. Oddman walked his rows on a Thursday morning and chose the test site, the 4th row of the 2nd acre, where the beetle damage had been heaviest, and the storm had pooled deepest, and the ducks had worked hardest. Kittle carried the fork. His hand had healed into a scar that pulled when he gripped, but he gripped. Eli stood beside the row with a burlap sack, her cough gone since August, her arms thin but steady. Oddman pointed. Kittle drove the fork into the hill shoulder, 4 tines angled under the plant base, and lifted. The soil broke open. Potatoes rolled from the hill like stones from a split wall, not small, not pale. Full-sized tubers, yellow-skinned, heavy in the hand, larger than Eli's fist. She picked up the first one and held it the way a child holds a gift she does not yet believe is real. Then she picked up the second, then the third. Then she stopped counting individual potatoes and started filling the sack. They dug the full row, 47 plants. The sack filled, then a second sack, then a third. Kittle weighed the sacks on the barn scale, the same scale Oddman used for grain and Beret used for duck feed, and the numbers came up in pounds that Oddman converted to bushels in his head while his hands shook. They dug sample rows across all 6 acres over the next 4 days. The yield varied. The low, wet acre produced less. The south-facing rows that had gotten the most sun and the earliest beetle pressure produced the most. But the full harvest came to approximately 490 bushels. 490. Not the 500 that a perfect season would have given, not the 600 that good soil and no beetles might have produced, but 490 bushels from 6 acres that every authority in the county had written off as lost. Niels Moen's comparable 6 acres yielded fewer than 200 bushels. 3 families on the road south of Hope harvested under 50 each. 1 family dug their entire patch and found tubers the size of walnuts. Not worth the labor of washing, let alone the labor of storing. The numbers moved through the settlement the way Clark's mockery had moved in May, from mouth to mouth, gaining weight with each telling. But this time the weight was not laughter. It was silence. The silence of men who had called 60 ducks blind and an old Norwegian simple, and were now standing in their own root cellars looking at shelves that would not hold enough food to reach March. Professor Beck returned in the 3rd week of September. He came by wagon this time, not rail, and he brought his scales and his notebook and a crate of glass jars for soil samples. He did not come to Clark's store first. He came to Oddman's field. He walked the rows the way he had walked them in June, hands clasped behind his back, bending to examine soil and stems and the residue of a season's battle. But his pace was different, slower. He stopped at the end of each row and wrote, and the writing took longer because he was recording things his training had not prepared him to see. Duck-tracked soil that showed higher earthworm activity than the poisoned plots he had supervised. Plant roots that had spread wider than expected, possibly because the duck's foot traffic had loosened the upper soil layer. Beetle counts in the test rows that were lower than any comparable untreated field he had measured in 3 years of extension work. He found Odmund in the barn, sorting seed potatoes into crates marked with charcoal numbers. Beret sat beside him, recording weights in the oilcloth notebook. Kittle stacked crates. Eli swept the floor with a broom made from bundled prairie grass. Beck set his scales on the workbench. He did not ask permission. He took a potato from the nearest crate, weighed it, cut it open with a pocket knife, examined the flesh, smelled it, and placed both halves on the bench. He opened his notebook to a page of figures. He compared numbers. He wrote something in the margin. Then he closed the notebook and looked at Odmund, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has lost an argument he did not know he was having. He said, "Your yield is 290 bushels above the township average for untreated fields." Odmund said, "I know." Beck said, "Your per-acre production exceeds my demonstration plots by 11%. Odmund said nothing. 11% was a number that belonged to bulletins and college reports. It did not belong to a barn where a man was sorting potatoes so his grandchildren could eat. Beck looked at Beret. He looked at the notebook in her hand. He looked at the crates and the scale and the burlap sacks and the duck yard visible through the barn door, where 60 birds stood in the late afternoon light with their bills dipped in water tins. He said, in front of Clark's name written on a debt ledger hanging from a nail, in front of Kittle and Eli and Beret and the ducks and the potatoes, and the entire accumulated evidence of a season that should not have succeeded, I was wrong about the birds. He paused. He was a man accustomed to precision, and precision required qualification. Not about poison always, he said, about this field. The old man had a method. Odmund set down the potato he was holding. He looked at Beck with the expression of a man who has waited 4 months for a sentence and now finds it insufficient. The ducks had the method, Odmund said. I only stopped men from preventing it. Beck wrote that down. He did not write it as a quote for a bulletin. He wrote it as a correction because it was. November came early that year, the way it always comes early in North Dakota, not as a date on a calendar, but as a quality of cold that enters the walls and stays. Root cellars across the settlement were thin. Not empty, because even a poor harvest produces something, but thin in the way that makes a mother count potatoes the way other women count coins, dividing the pile by the months remaining and finding the answer short. The first knock came from Niels Mohn. He arrived at Odmund's gate on a Tuesday afternoon carrying a silver pocket watch. The watch had been his father's. It was the most valuable thing he owned that was not nailed to the ground, and he held it in his palm the way a man holds something he has already decided to lose. He said he needed potatoes, not for himself, for Guro. The child had recovered from the Paris green sickness, but she was thin, and thin children in Dakota winters grew thinner unless the food held. He held out the watch. Odmund looked at the watch. He looked at Niels Mohn, the straight back now slightly bent, the practical mind now standing on another man's porch with a family heirloom in his hand, the doubt that had once asked, "Where is the profit?" now calculating a different kind of arithmetic. Odmund refused the watch. He closed Niels's fingers around it and pushed the hand back. The watch was warm from Niels's grip. He had been holding it the entire walk from his farm, 3 miles in November cold, rehearsing the speech he would give and the price he would pay. Oddman went into the cellar. The cellar was dark and cold and smelled of earth and straw, and the potatoes sat in rows on wooden shelves that Kittle had built in October, sorted by size, each shelf labeled in Marte Flatten's handwriting with the acre and row of origin. He filled 2 burlap sacks, 40 pounds each, selecting from the second acre where the yield had been strongest, and he carried them up the steps one at a time because his shoulder could not manage both. He set them on Niels's wagon and said, "Spring labor. You help me reset the lanes when the ground thaws. The watch stays with your family." Niels picked up the sacks. He placed them in the wagon bed with the care of a man handling something more valuable than silver. He did not say thank you. Thank you was a word that carried debt, and Oddmund had specifically replaced debt with work. Niels said, "I will be there." He looked at the duck pen, where the 60 birds stood in the cold, with their bills tucked under their wings, and he said, "I want to learn." It was the first time any neighbor had said those 3 words. They cost Niels more than the watch would have. He was the first. He was not the last. Over the next 3 weeks, 7 families came to Oddmund's cellar. Some asked politely. Some did not. Hunger makes people proud and mean in equal measure, and the combination produces conversations that sound like arguments and function like surrender. A woman from the South Road demanded to know the price per bushel and then wept when Oddmund named a figure lower than Clark's store would have charged. A man who had laughed at the blind ducks in June stood in Oddmund's barn and said, "I need 20 bushels, and I cannot pay until the oats come in, and if you tell anyone I was here, I will deny it." Oddmund sold at fair prices. He recorded names in a ledger kept in Marte Flayton's clean handwriting, because Oddmund's hand cramped after half a page, and Marte's did not. He set aside seed potatoes, a separate crate, marked clearly, stored in the coldest corner of the cellar, for any family that agreed to attend spring training. The phrase spring training had no meaning yet. It was a promise Oddmund made before he had designed what it would look like. But the promise served a purpose. It separated the families who wanted potatoes from the families who wanted to learn, and the families who wanted to learn were the ones Oddmund needed, because a method that lived in one man's head and one woman's notebook would die when those 2 people did. Clark's reaction to the harvest was not rage. Rage would have been simple. Clark's reaction was calculation, and calculation was more dangerous. He had expected scarcity. Scarcity was profit. Families who could not feed themselves bought from his store at prices he set, on credit he controlled, with liens that gave him leverage over next year's crop before it was planted. Oddmund's 490 bushels disrupted that calculation. Families who should have come to his counter were going to Oddmund's cellar instead, and every sack of potatoes that left that cellar was a sale. Clark did not make, and a lien he could not attach. He did not attack directly. He spread a rumor. Duck-worked potatoes were fouled, he said. The birds had walked through the rows with dirty feet, and the soil was contaminated with duck waste, and the tubers had absorbed whatever diseases the birds carried. It was not a scientific argument. It did not need to be. It only needed to make people hesitate, and hesitation in a hungry community was enough to slow the traffic to Oddmund's door. Marte Flatten killed the rumor in a single evening. She boiled duck-field potatoes at the schoolhouse supper, a monthly gathering where families brought food and children performed recitations, and she served them on the school's tin plates without announcement or explanation. Beck ate first. He ate 2 servings. When a farmer's wife asked whether the potatoes were safe, Beck said, "I have examined the soil, the tubers, and the method. The risk to human health is 0. The risk from storing arsenical compounds near food is not." He did not look at Clark when he said it. He did not need to. Kark was standing 6 feet away with a plate of potatoes he had not yet tasted, and every person in the room watched him take the first bite. The winter closed in, and with it came the part of the season that Oddman had not planned for, the part where success creates problems that failure never does. Beret stayed through November. She had intended to return east after the harvest, but the first heavy snow came early and blocked the road for a week, and by the time the road cleared, the duck breeding pairs needed sorting for spring, and sorting was work that Beret would not trust to anyone who had not handled ducks for 30 years. She and Oddman spent evenings at the kitchen table with the oilcloth notebook between them. They mapped the field lane by lane, recording which rows had produced the highest yield and which had suffered the most storm damage and where the beetle pressure had been heaviest, and which duck teams had performed best in which conditions. Beret improved his lane spacing based on what they had learned: wider gaps at row ends where the ducks turned, narrower in the long straights where momentum carried them. Oddman taught her his observation of beetle behavior by temperature. The insects were sluggish below 50 degrees and active above 65, and the window between those numbers was when the ducks did their best work because the beetles were slow enough to catch and active enough to be on the plants where bills could find them. Their partnership was not romance. It was the kind of bond that forms between two people who have built something together under pressure and found that the other person's mind fills the gaps in their own. Beret was systematic where Oddman was intuitive. Oddman was patient where Beret was blunt. Together they produced a body of knowledge that neither could have created alone, not theory, but tested practice, recorded in a notebook that smelled of oilcloth and duck feed and the specific kind of hope that comes from proving something against the weight of every authority that said it could not be done. They disagreed once, sharply, and the disagreement revealed the crack where their philosophies did not meet. It happened over the breeding pairs. Oddman wanted to keep every old bird, including the blind ones, including the birds too slow for field work, because the old ducks steadied the young teams, and because he could not bring himself to cull birds that had proven themselves. Beret said no. She said a flock that carries passengers eats more than it earns. She said the blind birds had served their purpose, and the practical thing was to keep the 4 best old birds for anchoring teams and cull the rest for winter meat. Oddman's voice rose for the first and only time. He said, "Marte saved the 6th acre." Beret's voice did not rise. She said, "Marte is 1 bird. You have 8 that cannot work a lane without stumbling. Sentiment is not a feed plan." They sat across the kitchen table with the notebook between them and did not speak for a full minute. Kittle and Eli, who had never seen the two of them in silence that was not working silence, went outside and did not come back until the lamp moved. Oddman kept all the old birds. Beret recorded the decision in the notebook with a single annotation: OB overruled. Feed cost noted. It was the closest she came to expressing disapproval in writing, and it was also the closest she came to admitting that a man who loved his birds too much might still be right for reasons her ledger could not capture. But Beret was 62, and the winter was not gentle, and the body does not negotiate with the calendar. She developed pneumonia after a cold rain in early December. She had been outside sorting breeding pairs in a sleet that came sideways and did not stop for 3 hours. Oddman told her to come inside. She refused because 2 of the yearling females had not been banded yet, and unbanded birds could not be tracked in the breeding ledger. She stayed until the bands were on. She came inside wet to the skin and coughing, and she did not stop coughing for 2 days. On the 3rd day, her breathing changed. The cough became shallow and fast, and her skin went hot, and she sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open and tried to write a correction on the feeding page. "Do not trust a hungry duck near young shoots." And her hand shook so badly that Oddman took the pencil from her fingers and wrote the words himself while she dictated. Marte Flatten brought tea. Eli brought blankets. Kittle sat outside the door because he did not know what to do with grief that had not yet arrived but was standing in the next room. Beret died on a Thursday evening in December. She died the way she had lived, with her hand on the notebook and her eyes on the work that remained. Oddman sat beside her as her breathing slowed. The flock kept tapping in the yard outside, bills against frozen water tins, the sound of 60 birds doing the only thing they knew how to do, and Oddman heard the sound and could not decide whether it comforted or punished him. He closed the notebook. He placed her hand on top of it. He sat for a long time in the kitchen while the stove ticked and the ducks tapped and the winter pressed against the walls of a house that had just become smaller. The notebook stayed on the table for 3 days before Oddmund opened it again. When he did, he found that Beret had written one last line on the final page in handwriting steadier than it had any right to be. The birds remember what you teach them. Teach carefully. Spring of 1907 came late and wet. The snow retreated in stages, leaving the fields brown and soft and ready for planting 3 weeks behind schedule. Oddman set seed potatoes in the ground with Kittle beside him and Eli dropping pieces into the furrow. And the work felt different this year because the work had a plan behind it, and the plan had a record. And the record was in a notebook that belonged to a woman who was no longer alive to argue about its contents. The spring training happened in Oddman's barn on a Saturday in April. 7 families attended. Niels Moen brought Guro, who was healthy now, but cautious around any sack that smelled of powder. Marte Flatten brought paper and pencils for notes. 2 families from the road south brought questions they had been saving since November. One man brought a pair of young ducks he had purchased from a farm near Fargo, and Beret would have told him the birds were too heavy for row work, but Beret was not there, so Oddmund told him instead, and the words in his mouth tasted like someone else's voice. He showed them the demonstration that Beret had designed. Kernels hidden under wet burlap in a trough. One cloudy-eyed duck, old Marte, still alive, still tilting her head, still finding everything her bill touched. The duck entered the trough and cleared it in 90 seconds. The room went silent. 7 families watched a nearly blind bird find food by touch, in conditions where a human hand would have missed half the kernels, and the silence was the sound of people understanding something they had previously dismissed. Oddmund explained the system. Not as a lecture. Beret would have hated that, but as a series of problems and solutions, each one demonstrated with a duck or a hurdle or a scoop with notches cut into the handle. He showed the lane spacing. He showed the bell code. He showed the feeding balance. He showed the water tins and explained why depth mattered and why 4 yards was the limit and why a duck with a dirty bill was a worker with broken tools. Marte Flatten took notes. She turned the demonstrations into written instructions, numbered steps, specific measurements, clear warnings, that any literate farmer could follow. She did not know it yet, but those notes would become the document that carried the method past the boundaries of Oddmund's voice and into houses where he would never sit. The second beetle season tested the method differently. In July of 1907, a heat spell accelerated the hatch across the county. The beetles emerged 2 weeks earlier than the previous year, and they emerged in numbers that made the 1906 hatch look modest. But this time, the first field they struck was not Oddman's. It was Niels Moen's. Niels had planted 5 acres of potatoes and purchased 8 ducks from the community breeding stock. He had attended the barn training. He had built hurdle lanes from creek willow using the spacing Oddman taught. He had cut notches in his feed scoop. He had done everything right, and the beetles came anyway, because beetles do not respect preparation. They respect nothing. Niels came to Oddman's gate at dawn. He did not carry a watch this time. He carried his hat in his hand and a look on his face that was not panic, but the thing that comes just before panic. The realization that knowledge is not the same as capacity, and 8 ducks cannot do what 60 ducks can do. Oddmund looked at Niels's face. He looked at his own field, where the beetle eggs were just appearing under leaves. He looked at the road between the two farms, and he made the decision that Beret would have made, because Beret had taught him that a method confined to one farm was not a method. It was a hobby. He moved 30 ducks to Niels's farm that morning. Kittle drove the cart with the birds in a crate built from fence slats, and the ducks pressed against the wood and made sounds that were not distress but displeasure, the sound of creatures being taken from the place they knew to a place they did not. Eli carried the water tins in a sack on her back. They set up lanes in Niels's rows using Niels's hurdles and Oddmund's birds, and the first team entered the unfamiliar field with hesitation that the home field never produced. The ducks stopped at the lane entrance. The soil smelled different. The rows were wider than Oddmund's. Niels planted at 30-inch spacing, Oddmund at 26. And the extra width made the birds drift toward the plants instead of holding the center path. Oddmund adjusted. He narrowed the lanes by shifting the hurdles inward and adding guide stakes at the turns. The second pass went better. Bills found larvae. The rhythm returned, but the time lost to adjustment was time the beetles used, and by afternoon the south rows of Niels's field showed damage that the morning pass should have prevented. Scale was the enemy now. 30 ducks on 5 acres plus the original 60 on 6 acres at home meant the teams were stretched thin. The rotation that had worked on one farm could not simply be doubled across 2. Rest time shortened. Feed calculations blurred. One team arrived at Niels's field after working Oddmund's dawn pass and moved through the rows sluggish and slow, missing larvae that a fresh team would have caught. Oddmund watched them work and heard Beret's voice in his head. Sharp, not starved. He had pushed past sharp into tired, and tired ducks were sloppy ducks. Then the dog. A loose dog from the Halverson place. The same family, a different animal, broke through the temporary holding pen at Niels's farm and scattered 2 teams into the open field. Ducks ran between rows without guidance. 3 birds trampled potato hills. 1 young duck panicked and flew into the fence wire and broke a wing. Kittle caught birds for an hour while Niels chased the dog with a shovel, and Oddmund stood at the lane end ringing the bell. 3 rings, recall, 3 rings, recall, and the old blind birds came back first because they trusted the sound more than they trusted the chaos around them. Kark did not help. He had fencing in his lumber shed that would have secured the holding pen. He refused to lend it. He said his stock was committed to paying customers. And he looked at Oddmund when he said it, because Oddmund's success had cost Kark the thing Kark valued most, not money, but the certainty that his way was the only way. Oddmund applied Beret's lessons. Smaller teams, more water, no work when stems were brittle in the midday heat. Count before pride. The phrase Beret had used when Oddmund wanted to push the ducks past their limits. Count the larvae removed, count the stems broken, and if the second number is climbing faster than the first, stop. Marte organized children from 3 farms as lane watchers, stationed at row ends with cloth-wrapped poles, guiding ducks through turns, counting birds at each pass. Niels sacrificed his edge rows, the rows nearest the field margins where beetle pressure was always highest, to save the center of the field where the bulk of his harvest would come from. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the crisis arrives. The second beetle season did not end with the clean victory of the first. Oddmund's own field lost yield to the stretched rotation, 380 bushels instead of 490. Niels's 5 acres produced 210 bushels, less than Odman's 6, but enormously more than the 50 or 60 he would have harvested without the ducks. 2 other families who had started small flocks that spring reported similar results. Yields below Odman's but above the township average, beetle damage contained but not eliminated, plants damaged but alive. The method was not perfect. Beret had never claimed it was perfect. She had claimed it was disciplined, and discipline was the difference between a season that fed a family and a season that fed a debt. Kark's final play before winter came at the township meeting in October. He had spent weeks building his case. He told the bank that Odman's loose duck flocks constituted a pest nuisance, birds trespassing on neighboring land, fouling soil, damaging crops. He convinced the township board to schedule a hearing on whether uncontrolled fowl constituted a public hazard requiring regulation. He expected Professor Beck to support the regulation because Beck was a man of science, and science meant control, and Odman's method looked like the opposite of control. The meeting filled the schoolhouse. Marte cleared the desks against the walls. Farmers stood along the back. Kark sat in the front row with a sheet of paper listing his complaints: property trespass, crop damage, disease risk, nuisance odor. Odman sat beside Niels Moen. Kittel stood by the door. Eli sat on the floor beside the stove because every chair was taken. Kark spoke first. He was not stupid. He did not attack Odman personally. He attacked the method as a public concern. Unsupervised birds on open land. No veterinary inspection. No guarantee that duck-worked fields met health standards. He asked the board to require permits for any flock exceeding 20 birds, and to prohibit flock movement between farms without written consent from adjacent landowners. The room was quiet. The proposal sounded reasonable. Regulations sounded reasonable. Permits sounded reasonable. Kark had learned that the most effective weapon against a man who operates outside the system is to make the system require permission he cannot get. Then Beck stood. He had not been invited to speak. He had been invited to observe, which in Kark's mind meant the same thing as being invited to agree. But Beck had spent the autumn writing a report that no one in the room had seen, and the report contained numbers that Kark had not anticipated. Beck said, "I have measured the Brika method across 2 seasons. The method is controlled. The duck teams are confined to specific lanes. The flock movement between farms this summer was supervised, timed, and documented." He opened his notebook. He read beetle count comparisons, yield figures, soil samples. He noted that arsenical residue in Paris green-treated fields persisted in topsoil for years, while duck-worked fields showed no chemical residue and higher earthworm density. He noted that the Guro Moen incident was not an isolated case. 3 other families in the county had reported skin irritation from improperly stored poison that year. He said, "I am not opposed to Paris green when properly used. I am opposed to regulating the one method in this township that has demonstrated measurable results without chemical risk to children and livestock." Kark's face did not change. His hands, flat on the paper in his lap, pressed down until the knuckles went white. The board voted. No permit required, no regulation on flock size. A recommendation, not a requirement, that farmers moving flocks between properties notify adjacent landowners. Kark folded his paper. He stood. He walked out of the schoolhouse without speaking to anyone, and the sound of his boots on the wooden step was the sound of a man who had lost a room but not his bitterness. Odman watched him go. He did not feel satisfaction. Satisfaction was a luxury for men who had won. Odman had survived a meeting, which was not the same thing. Kark still owned the store. Kark still held debts. Kark still sold Paris green. And Kark still waited the way a patient man waits for weather, not because he can control it, but because he knows it will eventually turn. The second harvest proved more than the first, not because the numbers were larger, they were not on Oddman's farm, but because the numbers now existed on 5 farms instead of 1. Oddman's 380 bushels, Niels Moen's 210. The Halverson family's 140 from 4 acres worked with a borrowed team of 16 ducks. 2 smaller operations that produced enough to fill their cellars and carry seed into spring. Against these numbers, the Paris green farms averaged between 60 and 150 bushels on comparable acreage, depending on how many applications they had managed before the midsummer rains. The comparison was not clean. No agricultural comparison ever is. The duck farms had better operators, more attention per acre, and a labor investment that the poison farms did not match, but the numbers did not need to be clean. They needed to be visible, and visible they were, stacked in root cellars across the settlement where families could count them by lantern light and know that the shelves would hold until April. Oddman did not celebrate. Celebration required energy he was spending on the thing that mattered more than any single harvest, making the method survive without him. The spring training of 1908 was larger than the first. 11 families attended. They filled Oddmund's barn and spilled into the yard, where Kittle had set benches made from planks across sawhorses, and Eli had swept the ground clean enough to demonstrate hurdle placement on bare earth. Oddmund taught differently now. In the first training, he had demonstrated. In the second, he made the farmers work. Each family handled ducks, real birds from Oddman's flock, not theory birds described in words. A man from the South Road who had never held a duck in his life found himself standing in a practice lane with a bell in one hand and 12 runner ducks staring at him with the particular intensity that ducks reserve for people who are about to make mistakes. "Ring once," Oddman said. The man rang. The ducks did not move. The man rang again, harder. The ducks bunched at the far end of the lane and refused to advance. Oddman took the bell. He rang it once, the same volume, the same duration, but he rang it while walking forward, and the sound moved with him, and the ducks followed the moving sound because following a moving bell was what they had been trained to do since the previous spring. "The bell moves," Oddman said. "You do not ring and wait. You ring and walk. The birds follow your feet as much as your sound." It was a small lesson. It took 12 seconds. But the man from the South Road would remember it every morning for the next 4 summers. Because the difference between a bell that rings in place and a bell that moves forward was the difference between a flock that worked and a flock that stood confused in a lane while beetles fed. Niels Moen taught the feeding balance. He had learned Beret's notch system and improved it, adding a 4th notch for hot days when ducks drank more and needed lighter stomachs to stay active. He demonstrated the scoop the way Beret had demonstrated it to Oddmund, with the same bluntness and the same insistence that guessing was not a method. Guro Moen, 8 years old now and careful around any powder that came in paper sacks, became the best beetle counter in the settlement. She could spot egg clusters on leaf undersides from 2 feet away, and she had developed a counting system, clusters per leaf, leaves per plant, plants per row, that Marte Flatten incorporated into the schoolhouse arithmetic lessons. The children of Steele County learned multiplication through beetle eggs, which was not the curriculum the state board had intended, but was more effective than any textbook because the numbers were real, and the consequence of getting them wrong was hunger. Marte kept the records. She had taken Beret's oilcloth notebook and expanded it into a ledger, a proper ruled book purchased with her own salary that tracked every farm's duck count, hurdle inventory, lane spacing, beetle observations, and harvest yield. She wrote instructions that any literate farmer could follow: numbered steps, exact measurements, specific warnings. She copied these instructions by hand: 6 copies for the first distribution, 11 for the second devise, because there was no printing press in Hope, and the nearest one charged rates that Odman's economy could not support. Each copy ended with Beret's final line: "The birds remember what you teach them. Teach carefully." Marte did not attribute it. She did not need to. Every person who read those words and had known Beret would hear them in Beret's voice, and every person who had not known Beret would hear them in the voice of someone who understood that knowledge is fragile and the distance between method and chaos is one generation of carelessness. Odman and Marte's partnership grew the way a field grows, not in visible daily increments, but in accumulated weight that becomes undeniable when the season turns. It had begun through work, the grain sack delivered to the schoolhouse door as arithmetic lessons, the ledger kept in handwriting cleaner than Odman's, the schoolhouse supper where she served duck-field potatoes and killed Clark's rumor without raising her voice. These were not romantic gestures. They were acts of competence performed by a woman who understood that the most useful thing she could do for a man building something was not to admire it, but to record it. The shift came in the winter of 1907, after Beret's death. Marte came to the farm 3 evenings a week to help with the notebook. She sat at the kitchen table where Beret had sat, and she wrote in the ledger while Odman talked, and the talking became longer, and the evenings became later, and the subjects drifted from duck spacing and beetle counts to the things that people discuss when they have been alone long enough to forget how to stop. One evening in January, the lamp ran low, and neither of them stood to refill it. They sat in the dimming light while Kittle and Eli slept in the next room, and the stove ticked and the conversation moved from feeding ratios to the cost of freight grain to a silence that was not uncomfortable but expectant, the way a field is expectant before the first green shoot breaks through. Odman said something about Sigri, not a story, just her name in a sentence about the way the kitchen used to sound when the stove was full and someone else was cooking, and Marte heard the name and did not redirect the conversation the way a polite visitor would. She waited, and Odmund, who had not spoken about his wife to anyone since the funeral, found himself talking about the second baby who did not breathe, about holding a child who was already gone and not knowing when to put her down, about the sound a house makes when it empties, which is not silence but something louder, the echo of voices that should be there and are not. Marte did not offer comfort. She offered something more difficult. She told him about the schoolhouse, about teaching children whose parents could not read and would not learn, about the particular loneliness of being educated in a community that valued land more than letters and measured a woman's worth by the meals she cooked, not the lessons she taught, about the morning she had found Kittle at her door with a split lip and understood that the boy was not fighting for his grandfather's pride, but for his own, because a child who cannot defend the adults he loves has no ground to stand on. They did not discuss feelings. They discussed work, and the work contained the feelings, and the feelings grew inside the work the way tubers grow under soil, invisible until someone digs. In the spring of 1908, after a year of shared labor and shared evenings and the shared weight of keeping Beret's method alive, Marte moved into the Breca house. The marriage was performed by a circuit minister who arrived in Hope twice a year and married 3 couples in one afternoon. Odman was 68, Marte was 41. The age between them was a fact that neither discussed, because discussing it would have required acknowledging that time was the one resource Odman could not manage with discipline and notches on a scoop. Kittle, who was 15 now and old enough to have opinions about households, said nothing on the wedding day except that the kitchen smelled better when Marte cooked. Eli, who was 12 and had been keeping the notebook entries since Beret's death, handed Marte the oilcloth cover and said, "This is yours now." It was not a transfer of property. It was a transfer of trust, and it cost Eli something she could not name, the last piece of beret she had been holding, and Marte received it with the gravity of a woman accepting a responsibility she had not asked for but would not refuse. By 1910, the Breka yard had changed in ways that Odman could not have imagined standing in a dusty lot with a torn grain sack 4 years earlier. 3 breeding pens stood where one holding pen had been. Each pen held a selected group of ducks, sorted by temperament, not age, following a system Beret had designed and Odmund had refined. The bold foragers bred together, the steady workers bred together, the calm anchor birds, the ones that responded to bells and held teams together in storms, bred in a separate pen because calmness was a trait worth preserving, and it did not survive random mating. 2 winter houses built from salvaged lumber and banked with sod kept the breeding stock through December and January. Odmund had learned from the year Beret died that pneumonia took birds as readily as people, and cold, wet ducks in open yards became dead ducks by February. The winter houses had deep straw bedding, ventilation gaps at the roof peak, and water troughs that Kittle refilled twice daily with water warm enough not to freeze for an hour. A spring training day had become an annual event attended by families from 4 townships. The morning began with Odmund standing at the barn door while families arrived by wagon, on horseback, and on foot. Children carried lunches wrapped in cloth. Men carried notebooks they had made from folded paper and twine. Women carried questions, sharper than the men's questions, more specific, because the women had been watching the ducks work while the men had been watching the fields. And the women understood that the difference between a method that fed a family and a method that failed was not in the planting or the harvesting, but in the daily discipline of bells and scoops and water tins. The training followed a pattern Odmund had developed through 3 years of teaching. Morning, duck handling. Each family took a team of 6 birds through a practice lane built in the yard. The lane was shorter than a field lane, 20 feet instead of 100, but it contained every challenge the field would present. A turn, a water station, a narrowing where 2 hurdles pressed close, and a section where burlap strips hanging from a cross rod simulated overhanging potato leaves. Families who could guide 6 ducks through the practice lane without breaking a burlap strip were ready for the field. Families who could not were told to practice at home and come back next month. Afternoon, beetle identification. Guro Moen led this session, which amused and bothered the adult men in equal measure. A 9-year-old girl standing on a crate explaining the difference between a first instar larva and a third instar larva to farmers twice her height and 4 times her age. She used jars of preserved specimens that Marte had collected and labeled, and she quizzed the children and adults alike, and she did not accept wrong answers with patience because Beret had not accepted wrong answers with patience, and Guro had learned from Beret's example, even though Beret had been dead for 2 years. Not all came to learn. Some came to trade ducks, exchanging yearling females from one line for yearling females from another, building the genetic diversity that Beret's notebook said was essential for maintaining vigor in a working flock. Some came to report results: this many bushels, this many beetles, this many broken stems, and the reports fed the ledger that Marte maintained and the knowledge that Odmund carried. The phrase blind ducks had turned inside out. It had started as an insult. It became a joke. Then it became a point of pride. Children from the training families competed to guide the oldest, cloudiest-eyed birds through practice lanes because the old birds were the steadiest workers and handling them required the most skill. A child who could guide blind Marte through a turn without breaking a potato stem had earned something that no schoolroom grade could match. Marte the duck was impossibly old. Runner ducks lived 8 to 12 years under good conditions, and Marte had been old when the story began. By 1910, she was a legend that might have been slightly exaggerated by the children who fed her. Slower now, cloudier, her bill still sweeping, but her legs unsteady on wet ground. Odman kept her in the yard near the house. She no longer worked the field lanes. She worked the practice troughs at training days, finding kernels under burlap with the same precision she had shown in the dust of a torn grain sack, and the farmers who watched her understood that the method had not started with a theory or a book or a professor's bulletin. It had started with one old bird who could see with her face. Kark held out longer than Odmund expected. Through 1907 and most of 1908, the storekeeper maintained his position. Paris green was the proven method, ducks were an eccentricity, and the township's tolerance of loose flocks was a temporary madness that the next bad season would cure. The next bad season did not cure it. It broke him. The winter of 1907 into 1908 was not the coldest on record, but it was the longest. Cold arrived in November and did not loosen its grip until late March, and the families who had entered winter with thin cellars felt every week of it. Kark had planted a small potato patch behind his store, not for food, but for speculation, intending to sell at high prices when the settlement supplies ran low. He had treated the patch with Paris green applied late in the season, and he had neglected the hilling because hilling was labor, and labor was something Kark paid others to do. The patch failed. Late poison application had not caught the second-generation larvae, and the neglected hills had cracked open in the frost, exposing tubers to rot. Kark dug his potatoes in October and found 20 bushels of soft, discolored tubers that even his own kitchen would not accept. Worse, the families who owed him money could not pay in cash. They could pay in labor, and the labor they had was promised to Odman because Odman had fed them when Kark would have loaned to them. And the difference between food and a loan is the difference between a neighbor and a creditor. Kark's store did not fail. Stores do not fail in settlements where they are the only store, but his influence, wow, the quiet leverage that came from being the man between the farmer and the supply chain, eroded like a hill in rain. Families who had bought everything on credit began paying cash from potato sales. Families who had accepted his liens began negotiating terms. The shift was not dramatic. It was the slow grinding of a gear that had been turning in one direction for 20 years and was now imperceptibly reversing. He came to Odman's barn during a blowing snow in January of 1908. He did not come during business hours when neighbors might see him. He came at dusk when the road was empty and the snow provided cover, and he stood in the barn doorway with his coat collar up and his hat low and the expression of a man who has rehearsed a speech and cannot remember the first line. Odmund was sorting feed into measured scoops for the morning. He saw Kark and did not speak. He continued measuring. 1 notch, 2 notches. The sound of grain falling into tin filled the barn the way a clock fills a room, regular, indifferent, unconcerned with the man standing in the doorway. Kark took 1 step inside, then another. He looked at the breeding pens, at the sorted feed, at the notebook lying open on the workbench beside the scale. He looked at the hurdles stacked against the wall, ready for spring. He looked at the water tins, deep and clean, set in rows on a shelf. He was seeing for the first time from the inside the machinery of the thing he had mocked, and the machinery was not grand or strange. It was ordinary, scoops and tins and willow rods and a notebook. The ordinariness was what shamed him, because he had treated ordinary discipline as foolishness and sold poison as wisdom, and the settlement had followed his advice until the rain washed the poison away and the ordinary discipline was the only thing left standing. Kark did not ask for potatoes. That surprised Odmund. He had expected the storekeeper to come for food, the way everyone else came for food. Instead, Kark said, "I want ducklings." Odmund set down the scoop. He looked at Kark. He looked at the man who had pinned the potato bug killer advertisement beside his scale, who had offered poison on credit with liens designed to trap, who had called 60 ducks blind, who had called hungry people fools, who had laughed with patient cruelty at a demonstration that proved him wrong, who had tried to regulate the method out of existence when he could not mock it to death. He said nothing for a long time. The snow blew through the barn door. The ducks shifted in the pen. Somewhere in the house, Eli coughed once, the dry cough of winter air, not the wet cough of the previous summer, and the sound carried to the barn like a reminder of everything Kark's mockery had cost. Kark said, "I called them useless birds." Odmund said, "No, you called hungry people fools for feeding them." The correction landed like a slap, not because it was loud, but because it was exact. Kark had done many things, but the worst was not the mockery of the ducks. It was the mockery of the families who had chosen to feed their birds when their children were thin, the quiet daily act of belief that Kark had treated as evidence of stupidity. Odmund did not forgive him. Forgiveness was not his to give, because the debt was not owed to him alone. It was owed to Eli, who had given her potato piece to a blind duck, to Kittle, who had split his lip defending the choice, to Niels Moen, who had walked 3 miles with a watch in his hand, to Beret Vangen, who had died with a notebook open because the work was not finished. He gave Kark 6 young ducks in spring, the same terms as everyone else. Return 2 females to the community flock. Attend training, all 4 sessions, not 1. Learn the bell code, the notch system, the lane spacing, the water depth. Demonstrate competence with a practice lane before taking birds to the field. And one condition that was Kark's alone: never again sell Paris green cut in flour sacks stored near food. Mark the sacks. Separate the storage. Tell every buyer the risk, not as a favor to Odmund, as a debt to Guro Moen, who had spent 2 days vomiting because a storekeeper sold poison without warning. It was not forgiveness, it was public discipline, and Kark accepted it because the alternative was standing outside the barn in the snow, while the settlement he had once controlled moved forward without him. Kark attended training that spring. He stood in the back of the barn with his arms folded and his face set in the expression of a man enduring something he had earned. When his turn came to guide 6 ducks through the practice lane, he rang the bell too hard, and the birds scattered, and Guro Moen, standing at the lane end with a cloth-wrapped pole, said, "Quieter. They are not deaf." The room did not laugh. Laughter would have been cruel, and cruelty was the thing they had all agreed to leave behind. But Niels Moen looked at Odmund, and Odmund looked at the ceiling, and something passed between the 2 men that did not require language. The years compress the way years do when the crisis is over and the work becomes rhythm. Kittle grew into a young man who improved the hurdle system. He designed hinged corners, joints made from leather strips and wooden pegs that allowed a hurdle to fold flat for storage and open to a right angle for turns at the end of rows. The hinged corners cut setup time by 1/3 and made it possible for one person to configure a full acre of lanes in an afternoon instead of a full day. He patented nothing. He showed the design at training day, and within 2 seasons, every family in the network used it. Eli became a teacher, not a school teacher like Marty. Eli taught at the farm, working with children who came for training days and stayed through the afternoon to practice guiding ducks through lanes. She kept Beret's oilcloth notebook in the schoolhouse where Marte taught arithmetic, and the notebook sat on a shelf beside the multiplication tables and the county geography text, and the children who opened it found pages of pencil notes in three handwritings: Beret's small, precise marks, Odman's cramped scrawl, and Marte's clean copper plate. Niels Moen named a breeding drake after Odmund. The drake was a large, calm bird with a habit of standing perfectly still while younger ducks rushed past him, and Niels said the resemblance was unmistakable. Odmund said nothing, but Eli reported that he smiled in the barn later when he thought no one was watching. Marte bore no children of her own. She did not seem to require them. She had Kittle and Eli, who called her by her name and not by any maternal title, and the relationship was built on the same foundation as everything else in the Brecka household: shared work, mutual respect, and the understanding that a family is not defined by blood, but by who shows up when the grain sack tears. She continued the ledger for 12 years. The entries tracked the spread of the method across the county and into neighboring townships. By 1912, 23 families maintained duck teams alongside their potato fields. Paris green was still used. Odman never claimed it should not be, but it was no longer the only answer, and the families who used it stored the sacks away from food and marked them with skull and crossbones that their children learned to read before they learned to read their own names. Beetle counting became part of school arithmetic in 3 townships. Seed potatoes were exchanged through a community cellar list that Marte managed from the schoolhouse, matching families who had surplus with families who needed stock. The community had not become perfect. Communities do not become perfect. Kark still ran the store. He sold Paris green alongside duck feed and kept his opinions behind a counter that no longer gave him the authority it once had. Some farmers rejected the method. It was too much labor, they said, and they were not wrong, because the method required daily attention that poison did not. But the families who stayed with it reported consistent results, and consistency in a place where weather and insects conspired against every plan was worth more than any advertisement pinned beside a scale. Odmund aged into a bent figure who walked the duckyard every morning and every evening regardless of weather. His shoulder never recovered. His hands stiffened into shapes that could hold a bell, but not weave a hurdle. His eyes, unlike his ducks, remained sharp enough to spot a beetle egg cluster at arm's length until his last season in the field, which was 1917, 11 years after the torn grain sack, 69 seasons of sunrise, walks through potato rows with bills tapping behind him. He stopped working the field that year, not because he chose to, but because his legs made the choice for him. A fall in the east acre. His boot caught a stake, his knee hit the hill's shoulder, and he could not stand without Kittle pulling him up, told him what his pride would not. The field was young work. He was not young. Kittle took over the morning passes. He was 24 now, married to a girl from the Halverson place, and he handled the ducks with an ease that Odman envied and admired in equal measure. Eli ran the training days. Marte kept the ledger. And Odman sat near the duckyard in a chair Kittle had built with wide arms and a back angled for a shoulder that could no longer straighten, and he watched the flock work the practice troughs, and the sound of bills tapping grain was the sound of everything he had built, continuing without his hands. Some mornings he spoke to the ducks, not commands. The commands belonged to Kittle now, but conversation, the way old people speak to things that have been with them longer than most humans. He told the breeding stock about the torn grain sack. He told the yearlings about Beret's mule and the willow rods, and the first morning a team of 12 ducks walked between potato rows and found 386 beetles. The ducks did not understand. They tipped their heads and watched him with eyes that ranged from clear to cloudy, and their bills moved in the small tapping rhythms of birds waiting for a bell that was not going to ring. Oddman Brecka died in October of 1919 on a mild autumn afternoon when the light came low across the yard and the potato harvest was stacked in the cellar, and Eli's pupils, she taught the children's training classes now, were cleaning seed potatoes for winter storage in the barn. He was 80 years old. He died in the chair by the duck yard. Marte found him with his hands on the armrests and his face turned toward the pen, where the season's breeding stock stood in the late sun with their bills in the water tins. She did not call for help immediately. She sat beside him for a time, in a second chair that Kittle had built the previous winter, and she held his hand while the ducks tapped, and the children's voices carried from the barn, and the prairie wind moved through the grass the way it always had and always would, indifferent to the presence or absence of any single person standing in its path. Marte placed Beret's oilcloth notebook beside him before the burial. It was not a practical decision. The notebook's information had been copied into the ledger and distributed across 23 farms. But the notebook was where the method had been born, in pencil marks made by a woman who came 15 miles on a mule because someone had asked the right question. And it belonged with the man who had asked it. Within 4 seasons of that first torn grain sack in 1906, the method had spread to 11 farms across Steele County. By the time Oddman stopped walking the rows, 23 families maintained working duck teams alongside their potato patches. They moved birds in lanes. They rang bells in code. They measured feed with notched scoops. They set water every 40 yards. They taught their children to count beetle eggs the way other children counted change, and the counting meant something because the numbers were the difference between a full cellar and an empty one. Oddman Brecka never became rich. His wealth was stranger than money and harder to spend. A root cellar that held through April, 2 grandchildren who survived to build their own households, neighbors who knocked on his door before hunger became shame, and a flock of birds that the county had once called blind and useless, and that had turned out to see more clearly than anyone who laughed at them. In the first week of that final October, the week before Oddman died in his chair by the yard, Eli brought one of the old ducks to the barn for the children's training demonstration. The duck was not Marte. Marte had died years earlier, though the children insisted otherwise, the way children insist that things they love cannot end. This duck was a granddaughter of Marte's line, white, cloudy-eyed, with the same tilt of the head that the schoolteacher had once been named for. Eli set a pan of wet grain on the barn floor. The children stood in a half circle. The duck lowered her bill into the pan and found every kernel, under chaff, under mud, under the husks that a sighted bird might have mistaken for waste. The children watched without speaking. They had heard the story. They had heard what Reuben Kark said in the yard that May afternoon when the grain wagon turned south and the sacks stayed on the bed, a man who feeds blind birds before children deserves hunger. They had heard the answer that no one gave that day, because the answer took 4 seasons and 490 bushels, and a woman who rode 15 miles on a mule in a cellar full of potatoes when every other cellar was thin. Outside the barn, the prairie wind scraped across the stubble fields, and below the ground under straw and packed earth, the potatoes held.